Hello and welcome everybody back to another Fireside Friday, and we are wrapping up our month on organized real estate with this last call in October. As we have done all month, I have Clint Skutchan here, who is leading our organized real estate consulting practice, and he'll help me co-pilot this call. And then I want to welcome our two guests who we're just so grateful you've taken some time out of your day to come talk to us and talk to our group. I have first Michelle Mills Clement, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the Chicago Association of REALTORS. And we have Angela Shields, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Tennessee REALTORS at the state level. So welcome both of you. We're delighted to have you here.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So we've just been checking in with everybody about how life has been in 2020, how your organization has been. And Michelle, I'll just start with you. Tell us what has 2020 been like for you? How has the quarantine gone? How's your family? How's your staff? How are you doing?
Well, thanks so much. I first want to thank you for inviting me here. It's really great. I've been tuning into some of these, so it's great to be a part of a conversation now. Really excited to meet Angela on here and have some more time with her too. So thank you for this opportunity. 2020 has been, I think, for everybody, a whirlwind, and it's been a lesson in just going with the flow. It's been a lesson in learning how to pivot. I think in the beginning with COVID-19 striking, I was definitely in this high adrenaline. I performed very well under pressure. So I was in a mode, like I was figuring out what we needed to do at the association with my family. And eventually, when this turned into not just a little bit of time and the shelter in place went into effect here in Chicago, I think like most people, I started to crash, when that adrenaline started to fade a little bit. And then you're like, okay, this is going to be in place for a while. And then when George Floyd was murdered, I was actually on a much needed vacation with my family, just a little getaway out in Michigan. And my husband found out what happened, and he purposely didn't tell me, because the reason we were away was to kind of unplug and give me a chance to recharge. And on the drive home, I'm looking at my phone. I'm like, did you see? He's like, yeah, I didn't want to tell you. And so that kind of added another layer, because I was not prepared for civil unrest. The couple days later, there was a lot of the rioting that happened was right outside my window. We have a 3-year-old, so it was a little bit scary for him, just standing there on the balcony and watching a lot of explosions and looting, but then also feeling a lot of the pain that as an African-American we face daily, but seeing it pushed to the forefront, it was hard. But I think I looked at how we can find a way to pivot even that too. And so it's been a good opportunity that this conversation's been coming to the forefront. So that's kept me encouraged. It's kept me wanting to still talk about what's going on, and it's made me more connected to family, friends, association colleagues, members. So it's all is not lost for 2020.
Yeah, it's both a scary time, but also a lot of opportunity to have conversations that maybe we should have been having all along, or more of them. So Angela, what about you? Tell us a little bit about your experience this year, and how is your family? How's your association, your membership?
Same, and I want to take the moment to thank you as well for allowing me the opportunity to join you. And Michelle, so nice to be able to meet you in this format. Wish it was in person.
Yeah.
But the same. I think none of us came into 2020 thinking that we would ever end up in this virtual environment. We started our year so excited with all the great ideas that we had planned, and we're so excited to get our winter conference in, our Hill visits, all the great things we were doing with our strat plan. And then all of a sudden you start hearing all of these lockdowns. We were all at President's Circle and we were hearing all of this. Is the country about to lock down? And of course, nobody believed anything like that. And it was shortly thereafter that we came back that Nashville quickly started locking down. We had our first cases. And we quickly using that word pivoted to remote access and working from home, and how can we start servicing our members. And not the same experience as Michelle, but very similar, that we started seeing the civil unrest. But before that, we actually had some different experiences here, because we had tornadoes that were ripping through our state, and we were dealing with those issues in addition to COVID. And then the civil unrest came, where we had that here in Nashville and in Memphis. And so there was a lot going on in our state, and it just kind of was, everybody was scratching their heads saying 2020, what else is going to happen? And then in July, the what else happened, because we had another tornado come through. So it was just, we at some point we were ready to shut the blinds and say, okay, we're done with 2020. But we didn't. We kept going. I quit using the word pivot, and I started saying we're just bouncing. We're bouncing from whatever happens to the next, and we're going to deal with it. And we're going to keep going. But in all, I think what happened with us is we learned a lot about how to do things differently, how to keep going. We saw how strong we really were. We saw how resilient we were, and learned a lot about our teams, our members, our leadership. And we have really great associations and really great leadership here in Tennessee, and we saw that. So we're doing good.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that, and hopefully we won't have any more severe weather, at least. Yeah. Hopefully, we'll see. Yeah. So this month, our T3 Fireside Fridays have focused on the organized real estate segment, and for this week, we wanted to have a conversation with both of you about diversity initiatives and get your perspective, because that it is, it is the topic of the day right now, and there's a lot of very active conversation happening in the industry currently. So I'm curious, first of all, to hear each of your perspective on DEI, and how you define it, how you look at it from the perspective as an association and association leadership, and then we'll delve into some of the what are you guys doing, that could be. But let's start with what's your perspective on it, being a leader of an association, on what it means. And why don't we start with you, Michelle?
Yeah, I think personally for me, DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I really put emphasis on the equity piece and the inclusion piece. Diversity can go any way, shape, or form. You can go diversity of race, gender, sexual orientation. You can go diversity of brokerage size, where you live, where you were born. There's so many different layers of that. And what I have seen happen in the past has been a fear to say, when I'm speaking diversity, I want to talk specifically about racial diversity. Either there's this scapegoat to say we're diverse because we have, someone from a big brokerage and a small brokerage. But really the problem people have wanted to tackle is, but we're not racially diverse, or we're not, diverse by gender. And sometimes it's scary to want to zone in on that. And so what I usually try to do is, when I start talking about diversity, I go back to that equity and inclusion piece and talk about, is this equitable for everybody? Is our association inclusive for everybody from all those different areas of diversity that, however you want to layer it, can be? And so we've been working on this since I got here. Real quick story, when I was interviewing for this job, my realtor was not a member of the association. And I remember asking her, assuming she was. And when I found out she wasn't, it was more so because she didn't feel that she fit in to the association. Even though she was working in Chicago, selling in Chicago, living in Chicago, she was a part of another association, which she felt like not quite even there, but more. She was more connected to that association because she felt this was only catering to one demographic of brokers. And what was interesting is that once I started interviewing and learning, that really wasn't the case. That it was a perception, but it was a little valid, because this association had a strong history and a lot of our racial discrimination to members, and to members of color, and members of women. And so she wasn't off base.
Mhm.
So when I came in here, it was really about making sure that we were servicing the entire city of Chicago, not just from a realtor perspective, but a community perspective as well. And this year in 2020, we've been able to be more hyper-focused on what does that look like here, and how can we help other associations achieve that. Right now, it's been pretty organic. Like, we don't sit in a nominating committee meeting and say, we need 5 African Americans. We don't have any women. We haven't had to do that because the leaders are coming to the table. We've created an environment where people want to join. They want to be involved from all different areas. But then you go back to that equity and then that inclusion piece. When people come here, do they feel included? If we hold events in different parts of the city, does everyone feel included to go there? Are we being really conscious about that? And on the equity side, this is one of the most segregated cities in the country. And what you can make for the same size home on one part of town compared to another part of town is vastly different. And that creates barriers. And so those are some of the things we're starting to look into, how we can increase on the equity side.
Yeah, it's really great. You have a very rich narrative about what it means in your community, and I really enjoyed hearing the example of you talked to a person who you thought was a member,
Yeah.
but they had a perception and also maybe a valid one, that they wasn't necessarily a welcoming association at one point in time, and that carries over. So I think that's acknowledging the historical nature of the realtor associations in the United States. So, well, Angela, what about your perspective on DEI you're at the state level, so you have kind of a little different perspective perhaps, but I'm interested to hear how do you define it? What are you looking at? What are you hearing through your membership? What does it look like for you?
And I think it's somewhat similar to what Michelle said, but where I would start with it is, I think most association executives would tell you that they are trained from the beginning with diversity to some degree, somewhat like what Michelle said. We're all taught that when you start looking at your board of directors, when you start looking at your committees, it should look like your association. And so you do immediately start, when you're trained, thinking about small brokers versus large brokers, men versus women, and all of that. So you kind of get that in your head earlier on. So I think, to Michelle's point, that's really not what it is all about when you start diving in further with the inclusion and the equity process of it. But unfortunately, that is what we're taught when you're just starting out. So from a state level, we have to look at it a little bit more with a state that is so large. You really get into, what do your members really feel, from the large cities to the small rural communities, to what is your commercial members, to the ones that want to work with land, to somebody who's struggling in those really tiny areas selling different properties there versus somebody who's working in those big cities. But then you have just a vast majority of different types of members, from different cultures to different backgrounds to different ages to, I mean, you name it, it runs the gamut. And I think that's something from a state level that we all have to have that conversation and start really focusing in on, to make sure that we're bringing everybody together. I know one thing that we really are trying to make sure with our culture is that we are looking at, how do we get our members wanting to come to the table, wanting to move up in that leadership role, wanting to get involved with our committees, and know that we value their experience, and they don't have to come from a certain community or a certain background or a certain culture or anything to be able to move up in our leadership roles. We want all of our members to feel included, and that's something we're really focusing in on.
I do want to talk about your organization and the things that you've done, but before we get there, I'm curious about your own experiences, because we've got Kenya, who's joined our staff and is focusing in on diversity and equity and inclusion, and a lot of that initial impetus was looking at our own leadership in organized real estate, in the industry as a whole, and it's not that representative. And I'm curious about your experiences. And Angela, I'll start with you on this one. You're in a state role, and while there's a large number of females who are in leadership roles, it's typically at the local level. There aren't a ton of females that are in a state leadership role. So what's your own experience been like in terms of leadership and inclusion and equity?
Sure. And I'll start back from when I started at the Athens Area Association of Realtors in Athens, Georgia. And then I went to the San Antonio Board of Realtors in Texas. And at that point, I was the first female to take on that role. And then coming here to Tennessee as the state exec here, I was the first female here in this role as well. I don't know exactly how many females there are. I know, as you said, it's more skewed toward the men, but you know, we support each other quite strongly. But I think the women that have come before me have broke that barrier for sure at the state level. I think the Cindy Buttses, the Andrea Bushnells, they probably can give you a much more glimpse into that experience of having to break those barriers. But today, I think we're very fortunate for all they went through to be the first, because I can't even imagine what it was like when you were the first one to walk in those shoes. It's not been that long ago that it was harder to get the roles as a female. And fortunately for us today, we haven't had that much. But I turn to, when you look at the 50 states, there's not that many of color that have the position at the state level.
No, yeah, another level of that piece. And Michelle, I'm curious, I mean, you talked about coming in, and I think, some of the things that you did initially, being hired into a leadership position, were pushing the level of comfort for many as well. But what was kind of your individual journey? What's been your experience in terms of looking at your leadership role in the context of organized real estate, or just real estate industry in general, being in a CEO position?
Yeah, I'm usually one of the few of color, younger woman. I started in association management and not in real estate associations. So I was at some other associations and they weren't all that diverse. But when I started to go to the senior leadership levels and moving up, then it was usually the case. I was the executive director of NAIOP Washington chapter, and that's National Association of Industrial Office Properties. So basically commercial real estate developers. And so I was it, I was it, like not even just on the staff side, within the membership, within sponsorship, like I was it. And then shortly after that, I became the CEO of the Commercial Brokers Association. And this was a member-owned commercial MLS, as well as an association really focused on, we had a commercial real estate school, also forums, products, different things that help commercial brokers basically be effective at their job. And I was it, you know what I mean? Like my hiring committee was all white men. The membership base is 6% white and probably 90% men. When I got there, there was one woman on the board and one woman that was ex officio and one African-American man. Glad to say by the time I left, there is more women on the board. The president-elect right now is a woman, which is awesome. And so there's been change that's been happening there. And my successor, he's definitely also focused on trying to increase that diversity. But we know it's not really there in the commercial real estate industry. When I came to CAR here at Chicago Association of Realtors, the only reason I was going to take this job was if I could be comfortable, I could be myself, and I can be open-minded and say what my experience has been. Coming back to Chicago meant that had to happen if I was actually going to have an opportunity to maybe make a change here. And it happened from day one when I walked into that interview, because I saw myself in everybody in the room. Rebecca Thompson had just had a baby and she was in there maybe a week or two after, and I had just had a baby 3 months prior, and I was literally just coming off of maternity leave when I was interviewing. And so seeing her in there, knowing, okay, here's someone that understands me as a mother, as a woman, as a young woman, awesome. I saw people that represented commercial real estate in the room, and I'm like, okay, they get me from this industry side because this residential stuff is a little bit different for me. Tommy Choi, he graduated from Bradley University, class of '03. I'm Bradley University, class of '03. We didn't know each other, but there's that commonality. Maurice Hampton, he was really close friends with one of my best friends. You know, Zeke Morris was from the South Side of Chicago where I grew up. And I mean, I can go on and on. Every single person, there was something that I could tie myself to and see myself. And so that created a sense of comfort. So coming in as the first African-American CEO here, it didn't resonate for me as such a big deal because I had always been in positions where I was either the first or the only, even growing up. I played soccer. I was always the only. Everybody knew who I was because I was the only Black person in the region at that time. I'm glad more Black women are playing soccer now. But, you know, it was normal for me. But what changed it was when other Black women would come up to me and be so excited and ask me how'd you get here? What's your journey? What do you do? How do you make it? And that really motivated me and encouraged me even more to make sure that I'm not the last.
That's an amazing piece that it adds a little bit of an additional responsibility to the
Yeah.
enormous amount of responsibility you
Yeah.
have anyway as an executive. But I mean, I know you well enough to know that you embrace that and you take that on with a lot of excitement and enthusiasm. And so, yeah, but for some that can be an additional barrier, right? Just that additional like encumbrance that others don't even have to think about.
It's a huge barrier. And I think you have to be comfortable in that space. And it's hard, you know, it is definitely hard. And there's days it's hard here. I could tell you stories about experiences I do have here at CAR with, you know, whether it's a membership base or whatever it is, it's not smooth sailing. You know what I mean? There's unconscious bias. There's things that I get, you know, a microscope on me about that, you know, other people wouldn't. There's things that are scrutinized for me that other people wouldn't have scrutinized. When I had an all minority leadership team, and there were complaints that I took too many pictures with minorities, you know, those are the officers. What do you want me to do? So, I mean, these are things that, you know, we knew what it was, but what's been good is the staff team here, they've been able to see it. And so they've been able to witness it and learn and be empathetic and work to want to change that without me even have to bring it up. And that's been pretty empowering just to see how that's happened here. Even before all the civil unrest and things that are happening these days, the team here started to see, hey, I see something that's different and I don't like that.
I do want to transition away just from that piece, and there's a lot of momentum, you know, around the country, but within organized real estate to no longer just passively, you know, address these, but rather directly. I think 3 out of the last 5 strategic plans that I've done have elevated, you know, DEI initiatives into their strategic priorities, which just was unheard of even a year and a half ago. So that's there. Angela, could you talk a little bit about how the state level is tackling this and where you're seeing the energy build around, whether it be initiatives or specific things being done to integrate it in kind of the association's focus and the deliverables?
Sure. So here at Tennessee Realtors, like probably most all state associations, we have a diversity and inclusion committee. And our committee does great things. They've accomplished some really neat things. As a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, they did this great think tank and had some wonderful ideas come from it. They brought all of the associations together, found out what the needs were for the state associations, and walked away with some good ideas to move us forward with our strat plan. As a matter of fact, we had one of our instructors, Cher Powers, who walked away with ideas and came up with this great program. She's now going around across the country and is doing this great class. But from that, they're now working on what they're calling a field guide. And the field guide is intended to be a resource so that it's a one-stop place that you're able to go in and find where if you're looking for information on fair housing, or if you're looking for speakers, if anything you're looking for, we're going to be able to have it for our members. But what we're looking to do is we paid attention to what NAR is doing with their ACT program. And our president, Hagen Stone, was really interested at looking at what Tennessee could do that would mirror sort of what NAR is doing. So we actually reached out to Kenya there with T3 and is looking for how can we work with Kenya and T3 there to now kind of go into 2021 and do our own ACT type program on our state level so that we can help with our own initiatives, do some research with what's happened in our state in the past, what are some ideas that maybe we could help move the needle with fair housing in our state, maybe honor some of our history, and maybe really do some great things with our local associations going forward, and look at where in our culture we can make some differences if needed. So we're really excited about going forward. We've had some really great strides with our local associations. We've had Memphis, for example, who did these really great things where they were honoring the HUD anniversary with some great marches. I mentioned with the tornadoes, Nashville Association was so good about getting into our communities that really need assistance to make sure that people that would take advantage of those homes that were damaged and maybe were lower valued. People come in and they want to buy those houses at next to nothing. And our realtors got in there and showed them, don't let yourselves be taken advantage of. Here's what your house really is worth. And so they went into those communities to protect those people. So it's things like that that we see our realtors are really out in the communities. They're doing great things, and we want to just keep that moving forward.
Yeah, just not only just, through what you can do, but then empowering locals that maybe wouldn't have those resources to collect them themselves.
Yes.
Michelle, you are at more of that local level. So what are the things that you've been able to achieve through your work at addressing DEI?
Yeah, so we have a diversity committee that we call the 77. It goes back to my story about wanting to be of service to all of Chicago. So the 77 is representative of the 77 neighborhoods in Chicago. So there's one representative, one realtor representative from every single neighborhood in the city of Chicago that makes up this committee. And from that, it's broken down into clusters. But the goal is to have that inclusive environment where everyone can hear what's happening across the board and across the full city scope. And it's taken a couple years to get it off the ground. So it wasn't something that happened overnight. There was definitely embedded within our strategic plan. We also ended up doing a little bit of piloting around it. There was application processes, but the group has gotten together and really amongst all this civil unrest that's happened has really just kind of skyrocketed in what they can do and achieve. We've done a host of cleanup and recovery days after some of the vandalism and looting that's happened here. They all also are trained on how to work with their elected officials in their individual neighborhoods to set relationships with aldermen, members of the city council, even of the state association. We work with them to make sure that they're aligned with who their reps are. So there's different aspects of how they can be engaged within the community. The other side to that is community partnerships. So working with other like-minded organizations that have, maybe it's around fair housing, maybe it's around tax appeals. We're starting to look at a lot of information around appraisals. We're seeing a lot of discrimination on appraisals, which we know about, but we're also figuring out what can we do to really move that needle. So this group is working on those type of pieces. From the other side to this is around training. We believe that training is one of the best ways to equip our leaders with how to interact in a world that we live in today, especially. Our board just passed a mandate that every volunteer leader of CAR has to have cultural humility training and unconscious bias training. And this includes any committee chair, work group chair, vice chair, board member, foundation member. If you hold a leadership position of any kind of CAR, it is mandatory that you go through this training. And so this has been a great opportunity so that we don't hear anyone say, I didn't know, or I didn't know you can't say that. Or if you do say that, how do you address it? You know what I mean? Or how do you have a civilized conversation about things? You don't always have to agree, but we want to equip people to be able to have those dialogues. On the staff side, we require it too. So the staff did a 7-week race and privilege course together where we spent every week together for 7 weeks, virtually, of course, but it gave us an opportunity. We broke down into small groups. We had facilitators for each group, and we went through this coursework together. And the goal of this is, I always like to lead with empathy. You know, think about what is going on for others, because a lot of times, especially when you hear, I did a interview with NAR with Eddie Glaude Jr., and there were a lot of comments going on. And when he started talking about Black Lives Matter, you get all the All Lives Matter stuff flowing. And it's a level of empathy that, yes, of course, all lives matter, but are you empathetic right now to what is happening to Black lives? That's really what the momentum was around that. And it's not just Black lives, it's every kind of gamut around these issues that happen. And so these trainings help us take the lens off and look at, how does this, play for you? How does this play for you that lives on this part of the town? How does this play for you as a man? Honestly, white men are also getting picked on a lot right now. Like, they're the problem. They're not the problem. They're great people that can be allies and really help in this situation. How can you be an ally? So our training has really put that at the forefront and given people the tools to do so.
That's really inspiring. I took some notes down here about the different trainings that you've been taking people through.
And
I had not even heard of cultural humility as a path. That's new. The unconscious bias and implicit bias. We've heard of that one.
Yeah, there's a whole step before you get to that. Before you even get to understanding your biases, you need to first learn about different cultures and how you interact and how to be empathetic before you can even recognize what your biases might be.
Yeah, well, I'm learning things today. That's great. That's one of the best things about these calls. So that's a great segue into kind of a conversation about, what should we be doing from, a state or national advocacy perspective? Like, there's a lot of different possibilities for action, and T360 is working with some associations and trying to craft policy, and like, what do we advocate for? What do we think that a future that is, more that has more representation? How do we get there? What are the things we do? So I'm just curious to hear from both of you, thinking about any state level or national policy or new requirements to become a realtor, or what are some of the ideas that have come through your organizations, or that you're currently watching and that are happening in the industry right now? And either one of you can jump in. I'm not going to pick on you.
Let me go, Angela.
Well, you've already kind of started some of your ideas. I'm going to let you go first.
Yeah, I think when I started talking about appraisals, that's one of the areas that we're starting to look at, is some reform around how appraisals are done, and what is the criteria to become an appraiser. It's very subjective at times, and it's easily an area that can be skewed one way or the other. So that's one area that our government affairs team is starting to look into and work closely with the 77 on how we address that. We're also starting to track some of the HUD rules that are coming down, and just seeing, like, there are some changes that I believe are coming up, and we pay attention to that. Brian Green, who's with NAR, used to be with HUD. He came out and was a part of our 50th anniversary for fair housing, where we actually issued a public apology for the role that we played in the industry. But he talked a lot about what goes on at HUD, and if there's anyone that knows, it's him. So we're starting to look at what's happening and finding ways that we can work with NAR, and also how we can get more connections within HUD to talk through some of those changes that we're seeing and make sure that they're equitable. There's also some areas around, I know there's been federally, the president has noted about how not having diversity training and how that can be un-American. And, we do speak out about those type of issues, because we, as I just pointed out, think training is really key and really a great way to make sure that there's fairness and equality, not just in real estate, but in every industry that's out there, and for everyone involved. So just some of those things that we're tracking. We also talk a lot about, credit scores, and if there's alternative lines of credit, alternative ways to track for credit. Tons of issues in lending is still happening. I've had my own lending discrimination things happening. My brother has been a victim of predatory lending very recently for me, a little bit, not a few years ago for my brother. And so that's still happening, CEO of the Chicago Realtors or not, it's still happening. I'm really excited. I have an awesome lender right now. We're not having any issues. He's amazing. But those are areas that we want to try to get a little bit more deep into as we're seeing that those are starting to become a lot of the barriers that are still in place.
Yeah, those are really great. I mean, those are hitting some fundamental underlying issues that impact the equity in the housing market and the ability to build wealth and to have communities where you can make progress. And it's like, you can't make progress if you can't get the loan.
Right.
Exactly. So it's an obstacle. So Angela, what about you? Any comments on national or state initiatives to tag on to that?
I'm just going to say, I think that Shannon McGann and her team at NAR, they're doing a great job of following various different issues. And I think we're always going to have issues that we're going to be following. Michelle just listed a lot of them, and we could probably sit here all day and have a whole different conversation just on that. But on the state level, we are always following ours, and I know various different states are following theirs as well. To me, what it really boils down to is we're always hearing this professionalism. And I know we don't want to get into the conversation about the code of ethics and all of that, but it really does come down to, I think, the way that we treat each other and we treat our customers and clients. And if we don't really dive into how everybody is treating each other and respecting each other, and whether it's just on a day-to-day basis, things aren't going to change, and they're just going to stay the same as they've always been. And to me, it just kind of comes back to what you were taught when you were in kindergarten: is play nice and respect everybody, and just everybody keeps asking us to. They ask NAR to make things harder for people to get into real estate, and so I think one of the biggest places they have to start is with professionalism, and how you treat people is definitely one of the places that you start.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Have either of you watched any of the Senate hearings in New York post the Newsday coverage? So I'm about 4 hours into watching the Senate, talk to the brokers and realtors that were they were in the Newsday study. And one of my biggest takeaways was that this is a professionalism issue where, people were getting, and the other piece of it is, I think people have a really hard time distinguishing their personal intent versus the actions they take. And they say, well, I'm not a racist person, but then they're doing a thing which is leading to outcomes that we don't want, where a person is discriminated against, and they're not even, it's that they're not aware of it. But it comes back to that professional training of, look, if you're going to require a person to have a pre-approval to go show homes, then you do that every time. Right. Like you have to have that consistency. So I don't know, what are your thoughts about the specific, are there any specifics of that training that you think that we need to improve that? And maybe it's some of the training we've already talked about, but what should we be doing to increase that professionalism?
We're redoing our fair housing course from scratch. We're still offering it, but we're starting to look at ways that we can make it more scenario based for that exact reason you just said. Yeah. Jack, times when people are not intentionally meaning some of the things they're saying or intentionally discriminating. It goes back to that unconscious bias piece. Where you just don't realize you ask a question. And again, I have had this happen to me within the last 2 weeks, just because my realtor represents a certain part of town. If I look in a different part of town, then they start to get questions about, well, do they have the money? Well, do they have this? Even though we have pre-approval, you know what I mean? So these things, and we know why it's happening. We know why it's happening.
Yeah.
And so,
Michelle, sorry to jump in, but I don't know if you saw the other day at NAR's 360, they talked about the power of scenario, training, and
yeah,
they're developing some at the national level. And one of those scenarios that they talked about was you then having to assume that role that you've experienced on a regular basis of how these, actions feel from the other side. And so the scenario plays out where you're the one who's feeling the brunt of the discrimination. And I think that would be such a powerful movement to have to see that, feel it, understand it.
yeah.
And so those scenario based types of trainings really get to a point where you onboard it from a personal standpoint.
It's so much more effective because it's just, you read about it, you hear about it, and you say, of course I'm not going to say that, or of course I won't do that. But then if you don't even realize that it rolls off your tongue sometimes and what it feels like and what the other person internalizes from that. When I first got here and we tried to rent a home in a neighborhood we weren't familiar with, kind of to date the neighborhood, they started talking to us about they don't take Section 8. You know what I mean? And I'm like, we never even brought that up. But for us, it was such a common thing that happened that we didn't even think about it. And I remember sitting in a meeting and someone made a comment about, oh, this is horrible. We're planning fair housing. Like, this is what, I can't believe this stuff happens. I was like, man, that happened to me on Wednesday. And they're like, what? It's like, yeah. And I told them the story. And then my team's ready to go get lawyers and stuff. So I'm like, hey, if I went out and got a team assembled every time something like this occurred, you know what I mean? This is all I'm doing. But it made it aware for me that so many people don't know. And I was so desensitized to it, and to the point that I accepted it. And so that's where, I think those scenarios are going to help change that, because even the person that's desensitized, like me at that time, you get your power back. You know what I mean? When you start to see like, wait a minute, no, that's really not supposed to happen. And hopefully it creates a cycle where we can all be aware and start to eliminate these practices.
I would add one thing I think it's interesting, and the realtor associations in general are growing up in terms of advocacy, especially beyond the NAR level, and learning what it's like to be proactive in your advocacy work. And so this is one of those areas that there's some sensitivity to it, but there's also a lack of experience in being proactive. But I would say if we're not, Jack's example of the Senate hearings is where those folks are going to start to get their own solutions in mind. And I think we know, kind of in a very difficult political environment, what those answers look like. So if we're not being proactive about it with a real estate lens and an understanding of this is practical, this can reshape. So I think associations across the board have to get better at being proactive, but specifically around this issue. Otherwise, we're apt to have others define what it should be for us.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. After watching the majority of that, I'm almost done. I got another hour left, but I came away with this thinking, oh, well, the New York State legislature is going to require implicit bias training. They're going to require, you can hear it from the questions that the senators are asking. So, but those are, those techniques, that cognitive behavioral therapy type of technique is where I think you actually, become aware. You're like, oh, I didn't even know I was doing this. And then you can modify behavior.
Now, some people know they're doing it.
Oh, no question.
They're doing it. No.
It's not always unconscious bias. Sometimes it's conscious bias.
People get real slick with how they ask the questions. And so, in those cases, I kind of feel like it is what it is. And we just hope that people will report them. But for others, just keep these trainings.
Yeah. No, that's really great. Well, guys, we are running to the end of our session here. So I always like to ask our guests if they have any words of wisdom or things that you think would help the brokers, agents, volunteer leaders on this call. Anything you've learned over the last year, or anything that you want to share with them as words of wisdom or advice for this crazy year we're going through. For running a good business, running a good association, whatever you have, it's an open table for anything you want to share with the group, and then we'll close it out.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Okay, I think around diversity initiatives, period, do something with it. I think we're not at a place anymore where any brokerage, any association can ignore it and not address it. And I'm being very specific to racial diversity. Look at your brokerage team, look at the management levels in there. Is it reflective of the world we're in, the cities we're in, the states we're in, the country that we're in? And if it's not, do some things very specific to try to change that. And that what I will say is don't feel like you have to have all the answers right away. It doesn't have to be an overnight thing that changes, but start to have that uncomfortable conversation and don't ignore it anymore, because we're moving into a place where people are going to start to demand it. And it not only demanding it, but also it's going to create a better environment and a better, business for everyone involved.
I agree. What I would add to that is that if you are a leader and everybody at the table looks exactly like you, then it's a very boring place. You are better off if you have different backgrounds, different experiences, different thoughts. All of that is going to bring so much more to the experience, and you'll go much further in whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. So the last thing I would say is, whatever you're going through in 2020, please be nice to everybody that you encounter, because you don't know what is really going on with whatever they're experiencing.
That is terrific advice. That is terrific advice, because we don't know what we haven't walked a mile in their shoes. We don't know what happened yesterday to them. So very well said. So, well, I just want to close by saying thank you so much for coming on today. I think this has been a rich conversation. Obviously, there's a lot more conversation to have about this issue in our industry. I think there's a lot of opportunity for leaders to step up and do great work and really help make a change happen, not just to paper it over or, say, hey, yeah, we have a group that's supposed to be doing something, but really to do things. And it's delightful to have two leaders here that are engaged in that and in this conversation. So again, I thank you for your time. I know the group that's been here has gotten a lot of value out of this conversation, and we look forward to more, hopefully in person, hopefully at the T3 Summit in San Antonio next year. So we'd love to do that. So, and Clint, thank you for co-hosting. This is great.
It's been a pleasure, Jack.
Great. It's been a great month. Great month. We've done a lot. So very good. Well, to all of our followers, we will have a new series starting in November. We're moving to a discussion about teams in real estate. And so we've got some really dynamic team leaders that run real estate teams coming up next month. So we're gonna have some great conversations with them about all kinds of topics. So please join us next Friday. We'll be kicking that off then. So I hope everybody has a safe and fun Halloween, and we'll see you on our next Fireside Friday.